Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Jasmine Kaur, and I am the executive producer at the National Library of Patient Rights and Advocacy. And today, joining us is Dr. Jodi Miller, who is the founder and CEO of WellCheck, a web based app designed to measure and track student well being. A former high school biology and anatomy teacher, she's also a postdoctoral researcher at Johns Hopkins University School of Education, focusing on how stress impacts academic achievement of students and how school environments can mitigate its effects. And it is an honor to finally have her here. Thank you so much for being here, Jody.
Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
It's honestly my pleasure to be even interviewing you because it is so interesting that stress has become such an important causal factor for almost all the diseases, especially in
Mhm.
mental well-being. And I am just curious to know, drawing from your experiences as an educator yourself, how did you observe stress manifesting among students, and how did the idea of your journey started?
Sure. So I was always interested in like stress, and that really only increased when I started teaching high school. So I taught, as you mentioned, 10th grade biology and 11th and 12th grade anatomy in Philadelphia, which I loved so much. And I was really young when I started. And so I say that because it influenced the way that I responded to my students. And so when my students were stressed, it would look like a few different things. So in some cases, they would just kind of check out, head down, really internalizing what's happening. And it was harder for me to kind of reach them and get them engaged. Then I also saw the externalizing symptoms. So that could look like anger or frustration, and that would manifest itself in like outbursts. Or I might say to a student, like, I need you with me. And then they like their anger and frustration just like comes out in their response. In some cases, we students would pick fights with other students, and that could even lead to like a violent encounter. Flip, like on occasion, students would flip desks. And I think more than anything, it was just like students didn't have this place to put these really hard feelings. And so they had to come out in other ways. And when I first started teaching, it was really hard for me to not personalize what it is that I was observing. And then as I got more experience and I came to Hopkins and started kind of doing more of my own research on stress, I was able to better understand that so much of what was happening in my classroom was not personal at all. It wasn't about me. And so it was more about, so my role then became like, how do I respond in a supportive nature? Like some of these things are still not okay, but recognizing that they're just evidence of these harder feelings going on.
Yeah, that is interesting that it's almost sounding like projection.
Mhm.
We have no idea what this child is observing at home and what the situations are at home or in the neighborhood or, you know, just what all is going on in their heads.
Mhm.
And I just that just makes me curious about emotional literacy and the vocabulary of emotions and um, in order for them to express exactly what they're feeling, was that bit of a challenge for you to navigate through or looking at their behavior rather than them speaking it out, that I feel angry or I feel emotional or I feel that I'm not being seen in the moment in the class. So what are your experiences with that?
So I think, yeah, I think it was really difficult for my students to use language sometimes to explain how they were feeling, in part because I think I didn't necessarily always ask the right questions back then. And I think also what was so hard was our days were so packed and I had huge classes. So we didn't really get many of those private moments. And so students were really cognizant of not having other people in their business, which of course makes so much sense. And so I think giving them I don't think I always did a great job of like carving out space. And I would try to find them at different points in the day. But if they weren't with me, they were with another teacher in math or English. And that is also very precious instructional time. And so I think it was not giving them the space to say, and also the space to say I'm feeling angry. And also, it can be really intimidating to say out loud, like, I'm feeling really frustrated or I think angry tends to be easier for students to identify as. Anger is an activating emotion, and it just makes it's something that resonates more with us as humans, I think, and is easier to say than I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling lonely, or I'm feeling left out, or I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling worried or afraid, even. And I think this reminds me a little bit of also what we were saying in the first question, but I think one thing that was challenging to navigate as a teacher is that one of my colleagues told me that we are the safest place for students to like project or respond like express their feelings to, and in all of the ways, right? Like they can yell at me. I would prefer that they didn't, but they can curse at me. Again, very much prefer that they didn't, but I will be back the next day and I'm not leaving. I will not yell or curse back at them. I will never hit them. Like I'm a safe person to just like rattle off that anger to. And so I think that's also something that is really hard in the moment to reconcile, but also helpful to realize that it's almost a sign of like safety in some cases that students can just let it out. But as far as literacy, I think students today are so much more emotionally literate than they were 5 years ago, and that they certainly were when I was in school. We didn't really talk about feelings that much the way we're talking about them today. And I also was always struck by students saying, like, I'm not going to be in school tomorrow because I have therapy. And I was like, amazing. That is so great. But they would say that out loud, and there wasn't the same kind of stigma attached to it. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but I still think we're not there yet. And for a lot of students, it's really hard for them to say how they're feeling out loud. And it's hard for them to especially identify those more vulnerable emotions. And so I think we're making progress societally, but I think we're not there yet.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I I understand that emotions are such a just the word emotion, I feel emotional, is such a vulnerable place to be. It's rather to, act up or show anger and, just say that I'm just mad at things, than admit that there's a vulnerability to what you're feeling at the moment. Especially in a school environment where there are, your peers, and there's an image that you have to maintain, and especially with social media and Instagram, and, just wanting to be a part of the crowd and stand out, all of that within the same environment. So in your research and in your experience, what were the systemic factors within the educational institutions that I would say inadvertently contributed to increased stress, or just affecting their well-being and mental health?
So that's such a good question. So we're thinking about systemic factors within schools because there's so many systemic factors outside of school. And I think uncertainty is a big one. So like food insecurity or housing insecurity, and or in some cases, I think depends on how students get to school. Like difficulty getting to school. If they're taking a train and a bus and a subway, or multiple, that's a lot. That can be very stressful. You don't have any control over the timing, so you can be late to school and class, and then somebody can give you detention, or you can get points off for being late, or there's all of these other potential implications that come, and it's not your fault that the bus is running late. You have no control over that. So I think the transportation element can be really stressful for students coming to school. I also think community and or lack of community. If students don't feel like they belong in a setting, that can really kind of heighten their sense of stress and make them feel uncomfortable, make them feel unwilling to take risks in the classroom or try. Somebody also once shared with me that students would rather be the angry kid than the dumb kid. Not that any of them are dumb, but what she was communicating was that students wouldn't, if they don't feel safe, then they they don't want to show vulnerability academically. So then instead they respond in other ways that might be less productive for a classroom environment. And so creating, to the extent possible, emotionally supportive classrooms where students are helping one another, where there's kind of a a no judgment zone. That's perhaps a little idealistic, but not, but something we should all strive for. We can get as close as we can. And so I think also depends on what type of school community we have. In some cases, you're bringing together students from all different parts of a city, and that can be really challenging because they might come from different groups of friends and they might not have grown up together. They might not know each other or trust each other. And that can be really stressful when you think that you could get jumped in school. That's certainly something that's stressful. There hasn't been as much research on this yet, although I imagine it's forthcoming. But I also wonder how many of our students think about school safety and what that looks like in this climate of they they are doing lockdown drills, they are doing school shooter drills, and there has to be a part of their mind that is attuned to that and ready for that. And so I wonder too if that's a stressor for them. So unfortunately, there are lots of different stressors that can exist in school. And then also the achievement piece, right? Like you want to do well and score high on your math test or whatever it may be. And I would say that shifts depending on where students are and what other things are happening in their lives. If they're worried about food or housing insecurity, then maybe that math test matters less. But if you are in a high performing community, the pressure to do well in that math test can be very high and crushing. So there are unfortunately a lot of different stressors that can make life hard for students in schools.
Yeah, and that sounds really hard. It might be outside of your scope of research, but I'm just really interested and curious about knowing how does social media impact the stress levels? Um, and with a lot of entertainment education that has been happening and a lot of content that has been made currently about how social media and certain misogynistic content on the web and
Yeah.
how students are engaging with it and, just getting stressed by how to show up in the world. How does that mitigate in school students?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really cool work being done about this. And as you can imagine, there's like a good amount of mixed findings. I think generally the narrative is that social media is harmful for students' mental health. And I think that that could be true. I think that there are ways that social media can be positive and leverage good like resources in a helpful way. Um, an organization called Hope Lab has done some really cool research on this, and so they're worth checking out. As far as my thinking, I worry that social media does a few things that might make it harder for students to kind of thrive. First is they are seeing a highlight reel of everybody's best life. And even though they can recognize that conceptually and cognitively, it doesn't make it any easier to see all of your friends at a party that you weren't invited to, or look how many friends they have, or look at all the fun things that they're doing. And you might not be included or able to do those things for whatever reason. And so that is certainly not great for the mental health of our young people. I also worry that it's taking the time and space away from other things, and that we students are connecting with peers on social media, but they're not having conversations. And are That's not true. They might be messaging back and forth, but that's my bigger issue and concern is we have this loneliness epidemic, and we have so many people feeling disconnected from others. And I think that's a big thing we're seeing with our boys is that it's really hard for young boys today to figure out how to develop friendships and build these connections where they feel emotionally safe, but they also don't feel too vulnerable because that could be hard, especially with male friendships. And so they're instead going to these other outlets like social media and taking in some of this content, which may or may not be toxic. And so I think I think it's harder to kind of put Pandora back in the box as far as social media, but so I think instead the focus should be on what else can we encourage students to do at that time to like foster connection and get them on the phone. They don't call each other because they don't like telephones or making any phone call. And but that was a big way my friends and I communicated growing up. And so how do we they will like FaceTime or do some things like that. So that's helpful. FaceTime is great, but like how do we promote more connection? I think if we can maybe think about our framing as less about diminishing social media use and more about like promoting more authentic in-person connections, I think that will help all young people. I think there is a sense of social media can be especially helpful for marginalized students in particularly like rural areas. So I'm thinking especially about students who identify as LGBTQIA or trans students who live in areas where maybe there are not that many other people around them who share their identity. And so having access to people who are trans as well or who are part of that community can be really healing and be really affirming. And so I think there's value there. And so it's not all bad by any means. I think I just want to think about how do we encourage young people to be off their phones and like playing with each other and talking to each other and like making up silly games and doing all of those things that are part of engaging with young people. So that's kind of my thought on social media.
Yeah, no, that is really thoughtful, and quite enlightening, to be very honest. And I am also thinking about educators, and it, just how are teachers and their well-being affecting the academic success of students, and does school prioritize a teacher's or an educator's well-being in the institutions, and how does that go about?
So part of my research as a PhD student was on teacher well-being, and it's something I feel so strongly about because as a teacher, my own well-being was compromised. You're giving and giving and giving so much of your emotional energy and love and patience, and it can be really taxing. I remember once I almost described it as like eroding rocks. Like you have the stress of the students and the stress of the position kind of washing over you. And by January, February, you're just worn down. And so you're more sensitive to things that might not have bothered you in September, October, but you're just more vulnerable and more raw. And so like, I think systemically, how do we take better care of teachers? I think there are a few different ways that we can do this on like a large scale. One is better compensation. That's not the full answer, but that will help. I think also, how do we reduce their workload? Maybe, and so smaller class sizes. What other supports can we provide them? I think about differentiation support. So, how do we say to this teacher, and some schools do this really well. So, this isn't to suggest it doesn't happen anywhere, but I don't think it's happening enough. Is how do we help educators connect with experts who can support them, whether that's behavioral experts, whether that's reading teachers, special ed teachers. So that way a teacher has some help in differentiating their materials for all the students in the classroom. Because as a teacher, you can have 8 years of reading levels in your classroom on a given day. And that's a lot. How do you cater to the student who is on the lower end of that spectrum versus the student who's at the higher end? And we kind of aim for the middle, but then we're losing students underneath and we're not really challenging the students on top. But it's impossible for one person to meet the needs of these, 10 different years. And so having support like that. I also think behavioral support is really important. We're seeing that happen a lot right now in these post-COVID years. Students are having difficulties regulating themselves. Teachers are experiencing the brunt of that in many ways. And so we need admin, we need social workers and counselors and other folks to really step in and help support teachers in that. And that doesn't necessarily mean being overly punitive. I'm not recommending that for students. I'm saying that some days students just like need a break from a space. And so who is there someone teachers can call and say, hey, I need this student to have a break. I don't want it to praise as like they need to be kicked out of the classroom. Like they just might need 5 minutes. Like, can you help them re-regulate before they come back? Or maybe just like keep them with you for 30 minutes. And just feeling that sense of support, I think would go a long way as far as helping teachers' well-being. Sometimes in some settings you need some parent support. like support to help navigate conflicts with parents if those arise. So I think the bigger picture is like how do we give teachers more autonomy and help them feel supported rather than judged? Like as a school, we are a community of adults doing really hard but really important work. And how do we support each other and collaborate to ensure that our students' needs are met, but also we're taking care of ourselves? Because, that old adage of like you can't pour from an empty cup, and that's a huge challenge right now. We're seeing so many teachers are emotionally burned out and leaving. We have teacher shortages, and teaching is such a wonderful career, and it should be like sustainable. You shouldn't be kind of compromising your own life outside of the classroom just to do it.
Yeah. Well, those are some really important points and something to be mindful about. Um, so how does WellCheck come into place, and how is that helping, and where are we at currently with the app?
Yeah, so I created WellCheck because of what I observed in my classroom. And I was doing research on stress, and what constantly came up as in something that was helpful was those social supports from teachers, peers, other adults at school. And so I kept thinking about what was life like in my classroom. And as a teacher, it would have been so helpful to have a better understanding of what my students were going through and how they were feeling on a given day. Because when I didn't know, something that seemed benign could lead to an explosion. And then we're talking about the explosion and we're not talking about what did the student need today and what's going on in their worlds that's making it really hard for them to be regulated in our classrooms. So, WellCheck is a daily check-in that just asks students, how are you feeling today? And it makes it easy for them to identify with those more vulnerable emotions. So they can click lonely or sad or worried or stressed without having to say it out loud. And they're able to then communicate that with adults in school. So as a teacher, if you're receiving that, okay, today is not the day to ask Samantha about her bio homework because she's just not in a great place today. And the bio homework can wait. We need to figure out how do we support Samantha? How do we build that rapport and relationship? How do we get her to a better space? And the rest will fall into place. And that really is the thought process behind WellCheck. And since we've launched, we've worked with hundreds of schools across the country. We're working with about 60 right now in a lot of different contexts, which is something I find really meaningful. So I get to learn about what's happening in South Dakota versus Indiana versus Baltimore City. And so it's great. We've added additional features so students can click the check on me button if they need some additional support, which has been really helpful for many young people, especially boys. I think it can be harder for young boys to ask for help. And so having this space where they can just click it, I think makes it a little bit easier. And it's great. We're growing and learning and getting better all the time.
That is so interesting. And I feel really proud to know you and know of
Thank
your
you.
work. It is such an important initiative, and it's very simple, and it fosters connection and emotional literacy, which is really important at the hour. Uh, how do you want the audience who's engaging with this interview at this moment to interact with your app, or any messages for them to carry forward?
Yeah, so we are constantly growing. And so I think my thought is if you are connected to a school and somehow you have children at a school, you work at a school, you live near a school, and you think that they would be a good fit for WellCheck or interested, we'd love to connect with you. You can learn more at the website, which is wellcheck.com, WELLCHEQ. You can also email me anytime. We're happy to give kind of virtual tours and talk about how it's being used in different settings. So our goal is really to just get it out there and te and help more folks learn about it.
Well, thank you so much once again, Jody, for being here. It has been such an informational session, even for me. And I'm pretty sure, our audiences currently are feeling that sense of warmth and positivity that, there are new initiatives being created in the public health realm. And
Mhm.
thank you so much once again for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.